Good afternoon, and welcome to this briefing of the House Health and Government Operations Committee. I am Delegate Sandy Rosenberg, Chair of the Government Operations Subcommittee, and will be chairing this briefing. This is a virtual committee briefing, so I ask for your patience if we encounter any technological or streaming issues. And this briefing is being streamed on the General Assembly's YouTube channel. We will be muted. Committee members will be muted throughout the briefing. If you have a question after the presentation, please use the raise hand function. I will call on delegates to ask their questions. Remember, please adhere to our usual committee rules of one question and one answer as recently been modified, and keep your questions shorter than the expected answer. Today, we will be briefed by Ben Yellen and Gregory von Lehman, representatives from an ad hoc committee of the Maryland Cybersecurity Council, on their report, Maryland State and Local Government Cybersecurity. It is our goal to conclude this briefing close to 2 o'clock. As a reminder to the members of the committee, we will begin having committee bill hearings at 2:30. Mr. Yellen, please begin, and thank you for your involvement.
Thank you, Chairman Rosenberg, and I will actually hand it over to Mr. von Lehman, who will get the presentation started for us.
Okay, well, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. So on behalf of Ben and myself, we appreciate the opportunity to provide an overview of the report of the ad hoc committee on state and local government cybersecurity, the Maryland Cybersecurity Council. Again, for the record, I'm Greg von Lehman, University of Maryland Global Campus, but I'm here solely in my role as staff to the Maryland Cybersecurity Council and as one of the lead authors of the report. Let me note that the report is the result of a broad collaborative effort that included DOIT, MDEM, and MACO, as well as CISOs and CIOs in other states, nonprofit organizations, and so forth. And that it also benefited from the series of hearings that were conducted by the Joint Committee on Cybersecurity, IT, and Biotechnology over the summer and fall of last year, 3 hearings altogether. And we thank the members of this committee who actively participated in those hearings. We benefited from your questions and your comments. And finally, I want to acknowledge the leadership of both of the co-chairs, Senator Katie Fry-Hester and, of course, Mr. Yellen. Their roles should be especially recognized. So next slide, please. So let me note that the Maryland Cybersecurity Council produced 2 reports on critical infrastructure last year. Of course, state and local government is critical infrastructure, and that's the one we'll brief today. But the other report is concerned with the cybersecurity of the electric utility sector serving Maryland. This report was actually put together by an NSA fellow who worked full-time in the Attorney General's office for 1 year on this report for the council. Both reports will inform bills this session, so I understand. So for the committee's awareness, we have just 1 slide at the end of this presentation that highlights key recommendations of that second report. And finally, let me note that among those who should be joining us today, I didn't see them a few minutes ago on the participant list in the Zoom, but we should be joined by representatives of the nonprofit Center for Internet Security, Curtis Dukes and Brian DeValence, who contributed to this report as third-party reviewers of the draft. And we should also have Mr. Sam Bell from Performance Solutions, who also provided us with perspective. And they would all be pleased to answer any questions if they are joining that this committee may have. Next slide, please. So the ad hoc committee was assigned 3 tasks. As you know, in our briefing today, we'll follow the organization of the report with my brief covering task 1, and Mr. Yellen's will cover task 2 and 3. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. So in its examination of the questions that were posed about governance, the ad hoc committee made 20 recommendations. Most of them fall into 6 buckets. As you can see there, And I'm not going to read them out because I'm going to skip through each of these buckets for you. Next slide. So one major theme of the ad hoc committee is centralization and consolidation. These are the most significant recommendations, I would say, of the ad hoc committee. The recommendations call for codification of the executive order that established the CISO, the state CISO role and its authorities. But the recommendations go further, calling for the consolidation of IT, cybersecurity, and staff and budgets across agencies of the executive branch. That would mean specifically that all IT staff would report to the DO-IT secretary, and that all cybersecurity staff within the agencies would report to the state CISO. It would also mean that the various separate IT and cybersecurity budgets that exist across state agencies would form one IT budget and one cybersecurity budget that would be administered by the DO-IT secretary and the state CISO, respectively. Next slide, please. The rationale for these recommendations, the benefits that you see there are really the flip side of some of the findings of the ad hoc committee. And some of these findings came out in the joint committee hearings this summer. Namely, DO-IT does not have complete visibility into systems at the agency level. It does not have visibility into the security priorities of agencies, their staffing, or their cybersecurity budgets. And at this time, it has limited visibility into agency compliance with its security policies. So what consolidation and centralization would do is it would break down these silos and would better enable the secretary of DO-IT to manage the IT budget across the executive branch, and the CISO to manage the cybersecurity of the state executive branch by having greater visibility into systems across agencies, being able to provide uniform operational direction, what are the priorities we need to be focused on, and also to achieve economies of scale with systems, tools, and so forth. Next slide. A second set of recommendations aim to close some gaps in the state supply chain, which is a significant vector for compromise. These recommendations would require state contractor organizations that have access to state databases, would require those organizations to meet certain standards, and would require smaller procurements that, while small, to go through cybersecurity review, since even small procurements can buy a lot of risk. Next slide. Cybersecurity, of course, is all about risk management. That's what it is. This entails knowing the threats to your organization, and those threats will vary by organization. So knowing those threats, the risk or exposures that you have when you compare yourself against those threats, prioritizing those risks, and then tying your budget requests to those priorities. The Maryland Cybersecurity Coordinating Council, which was established by the same executive order that established the CISO and its authorities, you can see the members there. It was explicitly set up to manage cybersecurity risk, but it has not matured into this role. So next slide, please. So to get there, the ad hoc committee makes two big recommendations. One is that agencies start compiling risk assessments by system and business function, that these risk assessments be aggregated and reported up in their organizations in a way that would enable the Maryland Cybersecurity Coordinating Council to execute its enterprise-wide role of looking at all those risks, prioritizing them across the executive branch as a whole, and then recommending investment priorities according to those priorities. The other big recommendation is to, in order to permit these sensitive discussions around threats, exposures, risks, priorities, to permit these sensitive discussions, the ad hoc committee recommended that the Maryland Cybersecurity Coordinating Council be exempt from the Open Meetings Act. So next slide. Cybersecurity funding model, the perspective of course, the way cybersecurity is funded now within DO-IT is on a chargeback basis. The perspective of several professionals interviewed for this study is that the chargeback model for cybersecurity creates a tension between the budget priorities of agencies to offer and support digital services for the general population on the one hand, and the need to invest in cybersecurity on the other. IT, of course, is a must-have. It's like electricity or plumbing in your home, but cybersecurity might become a nice-to-have. So the result is an underfunding of the cybersecurity function. Not surprisingly, in this vein, the 2020 survey of the National Association of State CIOs reported that the top fourth challenge reported by state CIOs, and this is 50 state CIOs responding, is the lack of an appropriated, dedicated cybersecurity budget. The majority of those felt that. It is far easier and more effective to fund cybersecurity across agencies from a dedicated, appropriated and central budget. The question then is how much should be dedicated to cybersecurity? This is a big question even in private industry. And the biggest spenders on cybersecurity are central governments, banks, and manufacturing. One benchmark metric that is used within sectors to allow organizations to compare themselves with each other in cybersecurity spending is the ratio of cybersecurity spending to total IT spending. The US civilian federal government ratio, cybersecurity spending to total IT spending, and this is a civilian figure, is between 16 and 17%. A Deloitte study that was based on a 2019 survey of financial services firms found that their spending was about 11%, their cybersecurity spending about 11% of their total IT. So there are a number of benchmarks out there, but this is one that we suggested in the report that the General Assembly might consider. Next slide, please. Changes in strategic planning. DO-IT, of course, has an IT master plan, and the ad hoc committee recommended that just in general, the plan should include timelines and metrics in the plan to better define what success looks like for the General Assembly and for the general public. The IT master plan also, of course, includes goals and objectives for the state executive branch cybersecurity. But if there's to be a separate appropriated cybersecurity budget, the ad hoc committee recommended that there be a separate and more extensive cybersecurity strategic plan to support those budget requests. And a number of other states do require this. Next slide, please. To wrap up, the risks that the cyber threat environment poses, not only to government data, but also to continuity of services. Because of that, the ad hoc committee recommended that there be public accountability for cybersecurity spending, just like there's public accountability for other types of government spending. Specifically, we recommended that the state, just like the federal government, these data are public, that the state, just like the federal government, publish its IT and cybersecurity spending and adopt a benchmark. We recommended federal civilian spending on cybersecurity to total IT spending. This metric against which the public could evaluate the overall effort of the state. So this concludes my portion of the briefing. I will return at the very end to say a few words about the other critical infrastructure report that I mentioned at the beginning, but most of what follows will be Mr. Yellen's briefing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Von Lehman. We can go on to the next slide. I'm going to talk about task 2 and task 3 of the report. Task 2 dealt with a survey we sent to state agencies. A couple of disclaimers before I get into some of the data here. We were assisted by the state CISO, who was extremely helpful in the data gathering process. Neither the state CISO nor any member, any staff member at Do It was involved in making the recommendations for this task. The recommendations were developed through the membership of the ad hoc committee, consulting with stakeholders across the state and across our units of local government. We sent out a survey in July of this past year to understand the status of cybersecurity risk across our state agencies here in Maryland, and to better understand the work of our state CISO and the Maryland Cybersecurity Coordinating Council. The survey was sent to 89 units of our state government, and we had a very strong response rate. 70 of them responded to the survey. So we were able to collect a pretty robust set of data to understand our vulnerabilities at the state agency level. We are very thankful once again for the assistance of our partners at Do It in compiling this data, and of course, members of the Cybersecurity Council, as well as the legislators, both on the House side and the Senate side, who are involved in the council's work. We can go on to the next slide. I'm going to go quickly through some of the more interesting survey results we obtained from the survey we sent to state agencies. Perhaps most notable to us is that more than half of the respondents had not identified recovery time objectives. So when those systems have to come back online to avoid some type of severe consequence, either to the agency's reputation, financial situation, or to continue to provide service to its constituents, to its citizens. Nor did these agencies, a majority of them, have a recovery point objective. A point at which to restore the data. So whether that was, restoring the data 24 hours ago, 48 hours ago, that had not been identified in more than half of the respondents within state agencies. It's encouraging that 80% reported having a complete or partial inventory of internal IT systems. Ideally, it is the belief of the ad hoc committee that we want to get that number closer to 100%, and that certainly informs some of the recommendations we make for this task. We can go on to the next slide. 46% of units that were surveyed have at least one legacy system. As we know, based on Dr. Von Lehman's research and best practices across the industry, legacy systems present a significant risk. They don't have the same security features as some of those modern updated systems. So this remains a major vulnerability for our state agencies. One of the key priorities that we identified in task 2 is modernization, to make sure that we are doing an inventory of IT systems and that we are prioritizing replacing some of these legacy systems. And I'll mention in task 3 that it's not just the state agencies that are using these legacy systems. Oftentimes it's units of local government, because the state uses these systems, that are forced to use these systems as well. You can go to the next slide. More than half of the respondents noted vulnerability scanning within standards. So half of the respondents who answered unknown received some services from Do It, but aren't aware that they received services from Do It. Once again, a majority of agencies that were surveyed were unable to even describe the remediation objective time for vulnerabilities of various severities. And we've seen that play out in the real world, certainly with some of the recent cyber incidents affecting Maryland state agencies. Go on to the next slide. I'm summarizing our recommendations. This is not an exhaustive list of the task 2 recommendations, but ones that I think are worthy of being highlighted. This here says that we recommend Do It should conduct a biannual cybersecurity survey. By the end of our process of consolidating these recommendations, we determined that that should be an annual survey of all state agencies. Each state unit should complete an inventory of their IT system by the end of this year in order to successfully manage risk. Units should develop specific recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives to ensure system recovery and continuity of services across agencies. We encourage regular backup operations and common cyber hygiene like multi-factor authentication practices to access remote desktops, remote systems, and email access. We have a recommendation that all units of state government should conduct cybersecurity training that reflects best practices. It is available for all employees and contractors for these agencies. And perhaps the most important priority for the ad hoc committee was, given the number of legacy systems in the state, to prioritize modernization, funding for upgrades of these legacy systems that present these difficulties, these vulnerabilities. So that was task 2 relating to state agencies. I'll move on to task 3, where we conducted a series of surveys of units of local government. We wanted to evaluate the cyber readiness of these units and the operational needs of our local governments, subdivisions, counties, municipalities, local health departments, et cetera, to determine how the state could best improve cybersecurity posture at the local level. We conducted a series of both surveys and focus groups of county governments, municipal governments, local school districts, and local emergency managers to understand what they're doing to prepare for and respond to cyber incidents, and how the state can best be an ally in ameliorating some of the negative effects of these attacks that we've seen on municipalities. Over the past several years, of course, there was a ransomware attack in Baltimore City that had an estimated cost of $18 million to that jurisdiction, a ransomware attack that affected the city of Leonardtown, a contractor that had worked with that municipality, and to the Baltimore County school system. So it's obviously a problem that has proliferated in the last several years. We can go to the next slide. So to summarize some of the more interesting survey results, many of our partners at the county level claimed, specifically in our focus groups, that they didn't believe their counties were allocating sufficient resources to cybersecurity. They wanted clearer standards to evaluate the effectiveness of their control systems. They were looking to the state to provide funding to the counties and obtaining resources. So upgrading software, hardware, also assistance in hiring IT personnel. And as I mentioned before, many counties rely on some of these legacy systems provided by the state. So vulnerabilities that are introduced at state agencies end up flowing down to our units of local government. Next slide, please. Some interesting data from the survey we sent to local emergency managers. 84% of our survey jurisdictions maintain cyber insurance. That was certainly a positive development. 90% of the survey jurisdictions are conducting regular technical cybersecurity awareness training. Many of us who have worked as contractors for units of local government know that that's certainly been in the cards for the past couple of years. We did note that even among emergency managers at the local level, more than half of the respondents did not have a consequence management plan for cybersecurity incidents, nor did they have a continuity of operations annex dedicated to cybersecurity. A minority of jurisdictions had those COOP annexes, but we were surprised to see that a majority do not. Move on to the next slide. Some interesting results from the survey we did of Maryland public schools. Only 31% of respondents among the LEAs at public schools indicated that their organization allocates sufficient resources to cybersecurity in their school budgets. Only 21% of respondents said that they have a disaster recovery plan and incident response plan that have been tested in the past 12 months. We also noted in both the survey results and in some of our focus groups that there is a disparity between urban and rural communities. Oftentimes our rural communities in Western Maryland and on the Eastern Shore only have one person in the school IT department. They were significantly burdened during the extended period of virtual learning, and they don't have access to some of the same financial resources that the larger jurisdictions have. So there is that disparity in our local school system. Going on to the next slide. Our municipalities survey, 90% reported that their municipal government had not conducted a vulnerability assessment of IT infrastructure and network. That was a very surprising finding that we saw in this survey. And none of the respondents among the municipalities who responded reported that their jurisdiction conducts regular technical cybersecurity awareness for the protection and mitigation of IT systems and networks. Many of our municipalities are small. They have one-person IT departments. So certainly we weren't surprised to see that sometimes resources are constrained, but some of these results were certainly eye-opening from our perspective. Next slide. That brings us to our recommendations for task 3. I know there is legislation that's going to be introduced on the Senate side relating to these recommendations to augment our units of local government. The first recommendation is that the state CISO should support a bifurcated cybersecurity effort for units of local government that features a partnership between the Department of Information Technology and the Maryland Department of Emergency Management. We have a matrix in our report that delineates their specific roles. DOIT is responsible for technical support, technical evaluation, prevention plans, and mitigation. And MDEM will do what it does best: communications, coordinating resources, and allocating those resources where they are needed. In that spirit, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. There is a unit that has been created at the Maryland Department of Emergency Management within the preparedness branch. There's the Cybersecurity Preparedness Unit. Our recommendation is that that unit be fully funded and supported and staffed so that it can offer the support necessary to our units of local government. Review for efficiency and effectiveness available disaster relief funds for cyber incidents to make sure that the state is equipped to respond to cybersecurity attacks. And our final recommendation is to establish a local cybersecurity support fund that would be available to units of local government. The details of that fund would be up to members of the legislature in terms of how it would be administered, whether that would be a non-lapsing fund. We don't have any recommendations on the structure of that fund, just that the fund be available to give grants or loans to units of local government to harden devices and networks, purchase new devices, new gadgets, potentially to be used to hire staff or contractors, paying outside vendors for cybersecurity related trainings. Next slide. So I will hand it back over to Dr. Von Lehman, who will talk about our separate report related to critical infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Gallen. We're doing well on time, and my comments should be concluded in, I think by 1:30. So the other report that the Maryland Cybersecurity Council produced last year, Cybersecurity of the Maryland Electric Grid, 59-page report. Altogether, it makes 29 recommendations. Many of the report recommendations can be implemented without the need for additional legislation, but Senator Hester's office has selected several recommendations from the report that she considers might benefit from legislative guidance. And that is 4 or 5 or 6 recommendations that I'm going to highlight now that will be part of her legislation. One recommendation, recommendation 1, in fact, of the report requires public utilities to include cyber resiliency in their own quality and reliability standards. Resiliency means ability to bounce back from what would otherwise be a debilitating or potentially catastrophic attack. Recommendations 4 and 5 require service providers, electric service providers, to adopt the NIST cybersecurity framework in advance toward zero trust architecture for both on-premise and cloud services. Recommendation 6 of the report, which again would inform for legislation, requires grid owners, state government, and local governments to come together and establish a process to identify, assess, and prioritize risks that concern the supply of the security of the electricity powering Maryland. And the results of this process would be used to administer a new grant program by the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, which would be available to utilities classified as critical infrastructure for cybersecurity and resiliency projects. And as I understand it, the grant program would pull funds from the state, local, tribal, and territorial grant program, $1 billion allocated, the Surface Transportation Grant Program, and also additional Department of Energy or EPA grants that may be available for energy, grid, and water systems. So I believe that concludes our briefing for the committee, and we have 30 minutes for questions.
We thank you very much, both Mr. Yellen and Mr. Von Lehman, for your public service, volunteering in this regard. And we now have several questions from committee members. First, Delegate Bhandari, followed by Delegate Cullison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Lehman and Ellen, for a wonderful presentation. When we talk about the critical infrastructure and building the framework, I believe that the structure of an academic program can facilitate this effort to improve the cybersecurity education. So what we have been doing and what we can do, is there any recommendation in your research that how we could bring our universities to help this in the long run?
Mm-hmm. Well, the report, the governance section, in fact, does touch on workforce development. You're absolutely right to highlight cybersecurity workforce development as a need. I will say that being familiar with the University System of Maryland, that all the institutions have cybersecurity programs, and the number of graduates that they're producing in those programs are published on the University System of Maryland website for everybody to access. Same is true of community colleges, which have active cybersecurity related programs. But there's no question that there's a big delta between the needs of the state, both public and private sectors, and the output of the post-secondary system. So there are efforts underway to build the pipeline at a lower level, that is K-12. Some of these efforts are private. The National Cryptologic Foundation, which is in Maryland, for example, has a curricular development program that's being piloted in various states, including Maryland. The report does not make any specific recommendations about workforce development, except to acknowledge that the state has taken some steps with the recent memorandum that was signed by the governor and UMBC, kind of a step to consolidate further efforts to bring talent into state government. But we don't go into detail into the efforts at the post-secondary level or the K-12 level to develop the talent pipeline. The report in general is a response to very specific questions that we were asked, and we, for the most part, confined ourselves to those questions, and workforce development was not one of them. But again, the report does touch on that, and certainly Ben and I would acknowledge, as would everyone on this call, that it is a big need in the state.
Thank you.
Delegate Cullison, followed by Delegate Saliga.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you, gentlemen, for this report, this very thorough report. So I guess I'm going to ask the question in this way. It's, given what I'm hearing you say, we as a state are probably do not currently have the capacity to maintain a high level of security, and that we have a number of different things that we have to do in order to achieve that. Specifically, asking the agencies to do risk assessment. I'm wondering, do they know how to do it, basically? That's number one. And do they need dedicated staff to do it? So I probably cheated and got more than one question in there, Mr. Chair, sorry. But if either one of you have comments about that.
I noticed.
Sorry.
No problem.
Mr. Yellen may have some comments on this. I think it would be a question better put to the state CISO, Chip Stewart. But I will say that it appears to be the case that state agencies are not doing the vulnerability assessments, or not able to do the vulnerability assessments that they should be doing. The governor's office had funded vulnerability assessments to do with state agencies. I believe in this budget cycle, more money will be allocated to those assessments, but this appears to be a need. More generally, the report, as you know, does emphasize that these assessments are really critical. They're the underpinning of the cybersecurity risk management of the state executive branch. And so it is extremely important that they be done.
I don't want to add too much to what Dr. Von Lehman said, except to reiterate the importance of doing these risk assessments, and to mention that a potential source of funding coming down is from the federal infrastructure bill, which has money for cybersecurity readiness, preparedness activities, mitigation, and response. So we're not being completely left alone to fend for ourselves at the state level. We are lucky to be able to be looking at some of these funds for states, localities, territorial, tribal governments.
Thank you very much.
Delegate Zaliga, followed by Delegate Pendergrass.
Thank you very much. This was a very informative, great presentation. And kind of going off Delegate Bhandari and Delegate Cullison, has anyone, it may not have been one of your charges, but did anyone look at how much money, what's the estimated cost it's going to take to get our IT house in order? I noticed, like you said, 76% of our agencies are using legacy systems. I mean, that's frightening. And we've been talking about that for, gosh, I've been here 12 years. 11 years ago, we were talking about this. So I'm surprised we haven't gotten further along, but did anybody take a look at the dollars and let us know what we're going to need to fix it?
Well, let me jump in. Senator Hester has been a good student of this question, and I wish she were here to answer it herself. But my understanding is that the estimate to the capital estimate to replace legacy systems is north of $1 billion, and she likes the model that Massachusetts has used to address a similar problem, and that basically is, I guess, to use the bond vehicle to secure the funds to make those capital investments.
Okay, and finally, I know a challenge is finding adequate staff to do this hard work, and a challenge that we've talked about in the past is adequately funding salaries within state government to pay these IT specialists to want to come work for the state. I mean, has that been looked at, or are we just going to sub that out because we can't afford to pay people what IT jobs demand today?
The report did not specifically look at that issue, but that certainly is a good question.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Pendergrass, followed by Delegate Bagnell.
So I'm trying to figure out the chicken and egg stuff a little bit here. And I have a problem because maybe what you're saying is, and by the way, the report is very helpful. It's nice to actually get answers to questions from IT people. That's a nice change here. So if the IT people do it are not funded adequately, you'd think we would know that. I don't think I know that. I don't know if they know that. Is it the IT people who are supposed to be telling the departments that they're supposed to be and have been supposed to be doing some things? the question is, if we throw money at a department that isn't doing what they needed to be doing with the money they had, do we have any predictability that anything is going to change? If they're not communicating with departments, for instance, can you make any comments about what you looked at in terms of present funding and future funding and relationship to quality?
So, well, that's a very good question. It concerns more operations than the capital investment that the previous delegate raised a question about. So I think the answer is this: the state needs to consolidate and centralize. Other states have done this. Vermont did it in a big bang through an executive order several years ago, and they've reaped some good results as a consequence. The idea is to get away from the federated or balkanized structure of the state executive branch, to consolidate IT staff, consolidate cybersecurity staff, consolidate cybersecurity budgets, consolidate IT budgets under the state's, the Secretary of Do-It and the state CISO. That would enable Do-It to know how much is being spent on IT across the enterprise, how much is being spent on cybersecurity as a baseline. And then they could assess what the needs are against that, and from that would come future funding requests. Ben, do you have anything to add to that? Or maybe Mr. Bell, I know he's joined us.
Yeah,
I would just add that, oh, sorry, Mr. Bell.
I'm sorry, Ben, go ahead.
I would just add that the purpose of the study was to identify those vulnerabilities. And so the vulnerabilities aren't just a function of funding, it was also a function of governance issues, as Dr. von Lehman spoke about in his portion of the report. So some of the solutions to these problems aren't going to be based on funding, they're going to be based on organization and centralization of leadership under the Do-It and the state CISO.
Yeah, I think organizationally, I think the thing that I've seen historically across organizations of all kinds of sizes is that when a cybersecurity budget is included with buying functionality, if you will, invariably functionality wins. And I think you heard Dr. Van Lehman speak about that earlier. Functionality wins and cyber takes a back seat. And really the goal of this restructuring is to make sure that cyber is prioritized in front, and to make sure that the resources are provided up front to make sure that cybersecurity can be baked in to these systems at the appropriate level, and that the state CISO and their team are able to then connect the dots across different agencies, as opposed to having a number of silos that are happening agency by agency that don't talk to each other, aren't necessarily built on the same infrastructure, and then become very difficult and challenging to support when you try to tack on security at the 11th hour.
Thank you, Delegate Bagnall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I'm going to follow on with Delegate Szeliga and ask, I know this report was not tasked with identifying industry comparable compensation, but what efforts are being utilized to identify industry comparable compensation, and or what do they need to be, and what do you need from us to make that happen?
Well, I'm not sure that's a question that I could answer. More of a question, I think, for the state HR function. Are they doing salary surveys? Is Do-It doing salary surveys in order to advocate for higher salaries for certain career lines? I just don't know the answer to that question.
Thank you.
Delegate Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for the work and the presentation. So, as I understand it, the consolidation plan that you and the recommendations you all are making would both address our issues of bringing us current and presumably also help us to stay current. How do you answer the question of how can we be confident that this consolidation doesn't increase our risk of single point vulnerability?
Both Ben and Mr. Bell may have something to say about this, but organization and operations are two separate things. So the idea is to create an organization that would enable the state executive branch to have complete visibility into the systems and the practices across the enterprise, and to manage risk accordingly. It doesn't necessarily mean that, and certainly let me add, the hope is that with that visibility, DO-IT would be able to implement systems across agencies, replacing individual or redundant systems across agencies to reach some economies of scale. But it doesn't mean that all systems would follow that path. And second of all, it would simply mean that the state, where there are systems used in common, the state would simply have to employ the appropriate security controls to minimize as much as possible the exposure of those systems. I don't think that's so that would be my answer. Mr. Bell, I think, is a technical person, and perhaps he could add to my answer.
Yeah, I think it's an absolutely fabulous question, because it asks the question, how are we not putting all our eggs in one basket, and then suppose somebody drops the basket, right? And one of the key principles, and there are many of them in cybersecurity, is a concept called defense in depth. So you don't just, or what I like to call it in common speak, belt and suspenders. You don't just rely on one set of controls in order to ensure your cybersecurity posture. You build it in depth with process, with operations, as well as with monitoring and controlling, as well as making sure that, as they mentioned earlier, you understand what your recovery time and your recovery points that you need to come back to are, and that systems that are that critical, and obviously the more eggs you put into one basket, the more you have to harden those systems. You have to make sure that they have things like hot failover, so that if one location goes down, the other location is there and available, and the transactions are synced within seconds, so that you can come back up and running. That all takes money, and that all has to be designed in from the ground up. You can't bolt that on at the end. And in my career, I've had many folks come to me in security and say, hey, can you make my application secure at the end? It's too late at that point. The ship's already sailed. And I think that's really the point of this. All of this legislation is to kind of right the ship and make sure that we point it in a direction of ensuring cybersecurity, and that we bake that in. And cybersecurity is not just let's not get hacked. It's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And make sure that we design, that triad in to everything we do across the state. And that will really help us move the needle and make us less susceptible. And also the last piece of that is, you've heard us talk about vulnerability assessments, which is one way to check, but also conducting security control assessments, which is making sure that your processes around your systems are being followed appropriately and documented appropriately. Everybody knows what they need to do. Those processes also act as a check and balance, from a operational perspective, to make sure that your cybersecurity position is being maintained, and that you actually are able to validate, what you're doing there.
Thank you for those answers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If I may, if I heard correctly, you referenced the fact that Senator Hester was introducing legislation adopting some or most of the recommendations. Are you aware of any member of the House who is doing that?
So far, I'm aware, at least based on conversations I've had, that Delegate Young is considering a consolidated bill with some of the recommendations, but I'm not aware so far of any cross-filed bills for the bills that Senator Hester is proposing in the Senate.
Thank you. Delegate Bandari, you've already asked a question, but if you can, a very brief question.
Correct. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is a follow-up question to my chair, Pendergrass question. The question was threefolded: present funding, future funding, and quality assessment. So I know that we don't have the comparison and contrast. It is not a consolidated system. What do we do for the quality assessment if whatever we are spending is working? Do we have anything in place, any mechanism? Dr. Lehman.
Do It certainly has its security policies, and it has metrics in its security manual. So it does have those things together are definitive of quality. If you wanted to know specifically what those qualitative measures are, I think the best person to answer those would be the CISO.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is very helpful to the committee, and we look forward to further consideration of this issue during the 90-day session. This concludes the briefing. I would remind the members of the committee that the full committee will have bill hearings starting at 2:30. We stand adjourned. Thank you.